The two officers thought they'd picked the perfect target. An old man in a faded flannel, no lawyer, no family in the courtroom, no one who'd miss him. They forged the report. They rehearsed their lies. What they didn't know was that the quiet man they were framing had spent 30 years handing down verdicts from a bench in another county. And the leather-clad stranger watching from the back row owed him a debt that couldn't be measured in years. When that biker stood up, the whole room went cold. Because some debts don't get forgiven. They get repaid. Before we begin, I'd love to know something. Wherever you're watching this from, whether it's a small town not so different from this one, or a big city on the other side of the country, drop it in the comments below. Let me know where in the world you're sitting as this story unfolds. And if you believe that no one should ever be crushed by the very people sworn to protect them, take a second right now and subscribe, because this channel is built for people exactly like you. People who still believe good folks deserve the last word. Now settle in, because what you're about to hear really happened. It happened in a quiet little town where nobody locked their doors, to an old man who wanted nothing more than to be forgotten. And to two men with badges who were about to make the single greatest mistake of their lives. This is the story of how a debt buried for 20 years came back at the exact moment it was needed most. And it begins, like so many of these stories do, on an ordinary morning that gave no warning at all of the storm that was coming. The town was called Miller's Crossing, though hardly anyone outside the county had ever heard of it. And that was precisely the way the old man liked it. Population somewhere under 4,000, one blinking traffic light at the corner of Main and 2nd, a grain elevator that hadn't turned in a decade, and a diner that opened at 5:30 every morning whether the world deserved it or not. He had come here 3 years ago the way a stone settles to the bottom of a river, quietly, without announcement, asking nothing of the water that closed over him. His name was Halloran. Just Halloran, to the few who knew it at all. The waitress who filled his coffee knew it because it was written on the check she never quite bothered to hand him, since he always left the same worn bills folded under the same chipped saucer. The man at the hardware store knew it. Beyond that, the name traveled nowhere, and Halloran preferred it stay lost. He drove a pickup the color of rust and regret, a truck so old the heater worked only on the passenger side, so that in January he rode with his coffee steaming on the seat beside him like a companion who didn't ask questions. Every morning he took the same route, sat in the same corner booth with his back to the wall, and watched the town wake up through a window fogged with his own breath. He spoke when spoken to. He nodded to the farmers. And then he went home to a small house at the end of a gravel road, where a fishing rod leaned against the porch rail and a photograph of a woman with kind eyes sat on the mantel, gathering the soft dust of a man who no longer had the heart to move it. His wife had passed 2 winters before he ever came here. Some men fold up entirely when that happens. Halloran had simply folded up his old life, packed it away like a robe he'd never wear again, and gone looking for a place where no one would ask him who he used to be. Because that was the thing about Halloran, the thing that mattered more than any of it. Not a single soul in Miller's Crossing had the faintest idea what this quiet old man had once been. He had traded his robe for a fishing rod and never once looked back. He liked being nobody. That decision was about to cost him everything. And save him. Every town has its keepers of order, and Miller's Crossing had too. They rode the county roads in a cruiser that always seemed a little too clean for a place with so much dust. And to the people who lined those roads, the sight of it in the rearview mirror had stopped meaning safety a long time ago. The one behind the wheel, more often than not, was Officer Pruitt. He was younger than his rank suggested and hungrier than his salary could ever satisfy, a lean man with a careful smile and eyes that were always doing arithmetic. Pruitt had learned early that a badge was not merely a symbol, it was a key, and a key opens whatever door you point it at. He kept his uniform pressed and his reports tidy, and he understood the one truth that men like him always understand, that the law, written down, is only as honest as the hand that enforces it. Pruitt's hand had not been honest in a very long time. Beside him rode Officer Dolan, and if Pruitt was the mind of the thing, Dolan was the weight behind it. He was a bigger man, slower to speak, the kind who had spent his whole life following someone louder and calling it loyalty. Dolan didn't scheme. Dolan didn't have to. He simply did what Pruitt decided, filled in the blanks Pruitt left him, and told himself, on the nights it was hard to sleep, that he was only backing up his partner. That was the story he lived inside. It was comfortable, and it was a lie, and somewhere underneath he knew it. Together they had built themselves a quiet little empire out of other people's misfortune. It had started small, the way these things always do. A traffic stop here, a search there. A frightened man with cash in his glove box and no lawyer on speed dial, who learned that the money could disappear into something called civil forfeiture and never come back, and that arguing only made things worse. The arrest numbers climbed, and their captain praised them for it. The seized cash moved through channels that were never quite examined. And month by month, the two of them discovered that in a town this small, with no one watching closely, there was almost nothing they couldn't take. You want to know the kind of men they were? Then picture the morning they pulled over a widow's grown son on a back road for a taillight that worked just fine. Picture Dolan filling out the paperwork while Pruitt leaned into the window and explained, in that patient, reasonable voice, all the trouble the young man was about to be in, unless. Picture the boy handing over $300 that was supposed to be his mother's grocery money, just to make the two officers drive away. They took it. They laughed about it later. And to them, he was nothing. Just another face on a back road no one would ever check on. Before we go further, I need to know who's in this courtroom with me. If you believe a badge should protect people, not prey on them, hit that subscribe button right now. Pruitt and Dolan are counting on nobody paying attention. Let's prove them wrong. Subscribe, and let's see this through together. It happened on an ordinary Tuesday, the way the things that change our lives so often do, without warning, without ceremony, on a day that had promised to be like any other. Halloran had driven into town for a part he needed, and he'd pulled his rusted pickup into the gravel lot beside the little repair garage on the edge of Main Street. There was a young man who worked there, a mechanic barely old enough to shave, with grease worked so deep into his knuckles it had become a permanent part of him. He was a good kid by every account, worked long hours, sent money to a family 2 towns over, bothered no one. And on that Tuesday morning, he had the great misfortune of being exactly the kind of person Pruitt and Dolan had learned to feed on. Young, poor, alone, the sort of person whose word would never weigh much against a badge. Halloran was reaching into the bed of his truck when he saw it. The cruiser rolled up. The 2 officers stepped out. And what unfolded in the next 90 seconds was something the old man had seen 1,000 times from a very different vantage point. Only never like this, never this close, never this raw. He watched Dolan draw the boy's attention with a barked question while Pruitt leaned into the open door of the mechanic's car. He watched Pruitt's hand move, quick and practiced, and come away empty. And he watched, a moment later, as that same officer straightened up holding a small plastic bag he most certainly had not found there, his face arranging itself into an expression of grim discovery. Halloran had spent a lifetime learning to read the difference between a man who finds something and a man who plants it. And he knew, with a certainty that settled into his chest like a stone, exactly what he had just seen. He should have stayed quiet. A wiser man, a more frightened man, would have. But there are things a person cannot watch and remain silent about, no matter how carefully he's built a life out of being nobody. Halloran stepped forward. He said, evenly, that he'd seen what happened, that the boy had nothing on him, that he would say so to anyone who asked. And in that instant, without meaning to, the old man stopped being invisible. Pruitt turned. He looked at the stranger in the faded flannel. The rusted truck, the weathered hands, the gray stubble of a man who clearly had no lawyer, no standing, no one waiting on him anywhere. And Pruitt did the arithmetic he always did. A loose end, a witness, a problem that needed to disappear before it could become anything larger. The safest thing, the cleanest thing, was to make sure no one would ever believe a word this old man said. So they turned the whole machine around. The mechanic was suddenly forgotten. And within the hour, it was Halloran in the back of that cruiser, cuffed, charged with resisting arrest and possession, written up in Dolan's careful hand as nothing more than a confused old drifter who'd wandered into trouble. What Pruitt didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that the confused old drifter he'd just cuffed had signed the sentencing order on Pruitt's own cousin 8 years earlier. That connection was a ticking bomb, and it wasn't the only one in the room. To understand what was coming, we have to leave that gravel lot behind for a while, and travel back 20 years, to a different courtroom in a different part of the state, back to a time when Halloran still wore the robe he would one day pack away for good. He was a circuit judge then, in the fullness of his career, known in legal circles as a careful man. Not a soft man, No one who spent decades on a bench could afford to be soft, but a careful one. Where other judges saw a docket to be cleared, Halloran saw a row of human beings, each one carrying a story that the paperwork could never quite hold. He read the files late into the night. He listened when others had stopped listening. And he understood something that too many men in his position forget, that the easiest verdict and the just one are not always the same, and that the whole weight of the law means nothing if the hand that wields it stops paying attention. One case, out of the thousands, is the one that matters to our story. A young man had been brought before him, rough around the edges, hard-eyed, wearing the beginnings of a reputation he hadn't fully earned yet. He was a prospect, they called him, a man circling the edges of the Hell's Angels, not yet patched in, not yet fully one of them. The charge against him was serious, and the room had already made up its mind. To everyone in that courtroom, he was exactly what he appeared to be. Dangerous, disposable, a young man on his way to a cell he clearly belonged in. Everyone had decided. Everyone except the man in the robe. Because Halloran had read the file, all of it, the parts the prosecution hadn't dwelled on. And what he saw in those pages didn't match the story being told. The evidence was thin in the places it needed to be thick. The account had holes a careful man couldn't ignore. And so, while a whole room waited for the old judge to do the easy thing, to look at the leather and the hard eyes and hand down the sentence everyone expected, he did something else entirely. He looked at the young man. Really looked at him. Not at the reputation, not at the club he was circling, but at the person standing there. And he saw someone who had been written off by every set of eyes in that room. Someone the world had already decided was worthless. Halloran weighed the evidence as it actually was, not as everyone wished it to be. And he ruled fairly. He gave that young man something almost no one had ever offered him. The simple dignity of being judged as a human being, and not as a costume. It changed the entire trajectory of a life. A door that should have closed on that young man swung open instead, and he walked through it into a future no one in that courtroom would have predicted. That biker walked out of that courtroom a free man 20 years ago. He swore he'd never forget the judge who looked at him like a human being. He never got the chance to repay it, until the morning he walked into the wrong, or the right, courthouse. The county courthouse in which Halloran now found himself was a plain brick building that had stood for nearly a century, and on the morning of his arraignment it held all the indifference such places accumulate over time. The radiators clanked. The benches were worn smooth by generations of the accused and the accusing. And into that room, a bailiff led an old man in a faded flannel shirt, his wrists no longer cuffed, but his shoulders carrying the particular stoop of someone the system has already decided about. The irony of it was so complete that only Halloran himself could feel its full weight. He had spent 30 years at the front of rooms exactly like this one. He knew every rhythm of it. The shuffle of files, the drone of the docket, the way a judge's attention could drift after the 100th case of the week. He knew where the mercy lived in a courtroom and where it went to die. And now, for the first time in his life, he was standing on the wrong side of the bench, looking up at it, one more gray face in a long day of gray faces. The charges were read against him. Resisting arrest. Possession. Written up in Dolan's careful, unhurried hand, cross-checked and clean, the kind of report that raises no eyebrows because it was built precisely so it wouldn't. There were no contradictions in it, because the men who wrote it had made certain of that. On paper, Halloran was exactly what they'd labeled him, a confused old drifter who'd caused a disturbance and resisted the officers who tried to calm him. On paper, there was nothing to see. The lawyer assigned to defend him was a public defender, and it would be unkind to call her incompetent, but it would be dishonest to call her present. She carried a caseload that would break a stronger person, 40, 50 files at a time, each one a human life reduced to a folder she had 11 minutes to understand. She met Halloran for the first time in a cramped hallway that smelled of old coffee, glanced at the report, glanced at the old man, and saw what the paperwork wanted her to see. She was not cruel. She was simply drowning, and a drowning person cannot save anyone. She advised him, gently and quickly, that these things could sometimes be pleaded down, that fighting it might only make it worse, that a man his age might not want the trouble. And here is where the whole story turns on a single, quiet decision. Because Halloran had a way out. He had, at any moment, one sentence he could speak that would change everything in that room. He could have told them who he was. He could have said the words, "I was a circuit judge for 30 years and watched the whole indifferent machine grind to a halt." He could have named colleagues who would vouch for him, produced a history that would make the charge against him laughable. One sentence. That was all it would have taken, and he would not say it. Now, you might be tempted to call that pride, stubbornness, the foolishness of an old man too proud to ask for help. But sit with it a moment longer, because it was something far deeper than that, and understanding it is the key to understanding the man. Halloran had spent his entire life believing in something. He had believed, through 30 years and thousands of cases, that the truth was supposed to win on its own weight. That a man should be judged by what actually happened, not by his title, not by his connections, not by whose name he could drop in a hallway. He had watched, from his bench, the wealthy and the well-connected wriggle free of consequences that crushed the poor, simply because of who they were and who they knew. He had hated it every time. He had built his whole life around the conviction that justice was supposed to be blind, that it wasn't supposed to matter whether you were a judge or a drifter, because the facts were the facts. And now the universe had put that belief to the ultimate test. To speak his title would be to admit that the system he devoted his life to only worked for people who could pull rank. To stay silent was to bet everything he had left on the principle he'd sworn by, that the truth, standing alone, unarmed, without a robe or a name behind it, should still be enough. There was grief in it too, if we're honest. His wife was gone, and with her had gone the part of him that had something to fight for. A man protects his name fiercely when he has someone to protect it for. Alone, in a rented life at the end of a gravel road, Halloran found he cared less about saving himself than about not betraying the one thing he still believed in. His silence was not the silence of a man giving up. It was the silence of a man refusing to abandon his faith, even as it cost him everything. That is not weakness. That is a kind of strength so quiet that most of the world will never recognize it when they see it. I want to hear from you right now. If you think this man's silence is dignity, not weakness, comment still standing below. Pruitt is betting the whole world stays quiet. Prove him wrong in the comments. I'm reading every single one. But strength has a price, and Halloran was about to learn exactly what his conviction was going to cost. Because the stakes in that plain brick courtroom were not small, and they were not abstract. A conviction on these charges meant prison. Real prison, for a man well past the age when the body forgives such things. He was not a young man who could wait out a sentence and walk back into daylight. For someone of his years, in failing health, a term behind those walls was very likely a sentence of a different kind entirely, one from which he would not return. Everyone in that room treated his case as routine, one more file to be processed and forgotten. Not one of them understood that they were quietly deciding whether an old man would ever see the outside world again. If Halloran had hoped that the truth would rise on its own, that the facts, left alone, would somehow float to the surface and clear him, the days that followed set about teaching him a crueler lesson. Because a frame is not a single act. It is a structure. And Pruitt, who understood structures better than he understood almost anything, was not the kind of man to build only one wall and hope it held. He built them one after another, patiently, methodically, until the old man was standing inside something with no doors. The first wall came in the form of a witness. It should be understood that Pruitt and Dolan had a problem, and they knew it. Their report was clean on paper, but paper alone can be argued with. What they needed was a living voice, someone who would sit in that room and swear they'd seen the old man behave exactly as the report described. And in a town like Miller's Crossing, where the two officers had spent months learning who was vulnerable and who owed them, such a voice was not hard to find. There was a man. We'll leave him unnamed, because he hardly deserves the dignity of being remembered, who had his own reasons to stay on the good side of the badge. A small history of his own. A few things he'd rather not have looked at too closely. Pruitt had leaned on men like this before. He knew the recipe exactly. So the man was coached. Not crudely. Pruitt was never crude, but carefully, over coffee, in the patient way he did everything. He was reminded of what he'd supposedly seen. He was walked through the details until they felt like memories. He was told which words to use and which to avoid, and he was made to understand, without anything so foolish as a direct threat, that his own comfort depended on the old man's ruin. By the time he was ready to testify, the man half believed it himself. That is the terrible genius of it. A well-coached lie doesn't feel like lying to the person telling it. It feels like doing what you're supposed to do. And when that witness took his seat and calmly described a disturbance that never happened, an old man raving and resisting where there had been only a quiet stranger stating what he'd seen, the second wall of the frame slid into place, and it held. But the wall that truly closed the trap was one that Halloran built himself, without ever intending to. Because eventually, of course, the question of his identity could not stay buried forever. Some clerk, somewhere in the machinery, ran the old man's name against the records, and what came back did not match the picture the officers had painted. This was no drifter. This was a man with a history, a real past, a name that had once meant something in the legal world of another county. And you might think, surely that would help him. Surely the moment they discovered he'd been a judge, the whole rotten structure would collapse under the weight of its own absurdity. You would be wrong. And the reason why is the darkest turn in this entire story. Because in the hands of a man like Pruitt, the truth itself became a weapon aimed at Halloran's chest. The discovery was not framed as this man is a respected retired judge. How could the charges possibly be true? It was framed as something else entirely. Why? Pruitt let it be known. Would a man like that hide who he is? Why would a former judge, of all people, sit silent through an arraignment and let himself be called a drifter, unless he had something to hide? An innocent man announces himself. A guilty man conceals himself. The very silence that Halloran had chosen out of principle, out of that stubborn, beautiful faith that the truth should win on its own, was turned inside out and held up as proof of his guilt. Think of the cruelty of that. The thing he had done for the most honorable reason in the world was recast as the behavior of a man with secrets. His integrity was dressed up as deception. And the worst part was that it worked, because to an outside observer who knew none of what we know, the question had a horrible logic to it. Why would a man hide his own name? The people in that courtroom did not understand that they were watching a man of principle. They only saw a man behaving strangely, and strange behavior, in a courtroom, is the fertile soil in which convictions grow. And so the walls stood, the clean report, the coached witness, and now the old man's own silence, twisted into evidence against him. Everywhere Halloran turned, there was another surface with no give in it. His overworked lawyers saw no way through. The facts he'd trusted to save him had been arranged, one by one, into the shape of his guilt. For the first time, sitting in that cold brick building, the old judge who had believed his whole life that the truth would win began to feel the terrible possibility that it might not. That a person could be entirely innocent and still be crushed, simply because the machinery had been pointed at him by men who knew how to work it. It was, by any honest measure, hopeless. And if you were sitting in that gallery watching it unfold, you would have felt the air go out of the room. But there is one detail I have been holding back from you. One small thing that no one in that courtroom paid any attention to, because it seemed to mean nothing at all. In the back row of the gallery, through every single hearing, there sat a man. He was not family. Halloran had none there. He was not press. The case was far too small to draw them. He simply arrived before each session, took the same seat at the very back, and sat there in silence from beginning to end. He wore a leather cut, worn soft with years and miles, and he never spoke, never approached anyone, never so much as shifted in his seat when the testimony turned against the old man. He just watched. He watched everything, with the stillness of a man who was waiting for something. Nobody knew why he was there. The bailiff assumed he had the wrong case. He didn't. It happened during a recess, in the same cramped hallway that smelled of old coffee, and it began the way important things so often do, quietly, almost unnoticed. The public defender was standing alone, files pressed against her chest, stealing a moment to breathe before the machinery started up again. She was tired in the way that goes past the body and settles into the spirit, the tiredness of someone who loses more often than she wins and has stopped letting herself feel it. And she looked up to find the man in the leather cut standing in front of her. She had noticed him, of course. Everyone had noticed him and then decided he was nobody's business. But now he was here, close enough to speak to, and there was something in his stillness that made her go quiet before he'd said a word. He was not a young man anymore. The years and the road had marked him. But he carried himself with the settled certainty of a man who had long ago stopped being afraid of rooms like this one. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and even, and what he said stopped her cold. He asked her if she had any idea who she was actually defending. She started to answer, the tired professional answer, the my client is answer. And he shook his head, gently, and told her the truth. He told her that the old man she'd written off as a confused drifter had once been a circuit judge, a real one, a good one, 30 years on the bench in another part of the state. And then he told her the rest. The part that mattered. The part that explained why a man in a leather cut had been sitting in the back of her courtroom, silent, through every hearing. 20 years ago, he said, he had stood in a courtroom exactly like this one. Young, angry, circling a life that was going to swallow him. Everyone in that room had already decided what he was. Everyone had looked at the leather and the reputation and seen a man not worth saving. Everyone, he said, except the judge. That judge had read the file when no one else bothered to. That judge had seen the truth of the charge when the whole room wanted the easy lie. And that judge had done something no one had ever done for him before. He had looked at him like a human being and ruled fairly and given him back a future he had already stopped believing he deserved. He had walked out of that courtroom a free man. He had built a life on the second chance a stranger in a robe had handed him. And he had promised himself, on that day and every day since, that if the world ever gave him the chance to repay that debt, he would not hesitate. For 20 years, the chance had never come. And then one day he'd heard. The way news travels among people who watch out for one another, that an old man was being railroaded in a small county court. A quiet man in a faded flannel. A former judge, they said, though no one seemed to believe it. He had driven a long way to sit in the back of that courtroom. And the moment he laid eyes on the accused, he had known. The face was older, worn down by grief and years, but he had known it instantly. It was the man who had saved him. The lawyer stood there, the pieces snapping together in her mind, and for the first time and longer than she could remember, she felt something that resembled hope. Because this changed everything. Here was a witness to the old man's character, a living reason to look harder at the whole rotten case. Here, finally, was a thread to pull. And that is exactly when the story twisted the knife. Because when she brought it to Halloran, when she sat down across from the old man, her exhaustion suddenly lit from within and told him that the biker in the back had come to help, that they could use his history, his identity, his standing to fight this thing. Halloran shook his head. He would not allow it. He was grateful. You could see that it moved him, that a man he'd barely remembered had crossed the state to stand with him. But he would not let them win the case that way. To use his title now, to pull rank, to let a courtroom decide his innocence because he turned out to be a judge rather than a drifter, that was the very thing he had spent his whole life despising. It would prove that the system only worked for people who could produce the right name at the right moment. He had made his stand. The truth would clear him as it cleared anyone, standing on nothing but itself, or it would not clear him at all. And so the one door that had finally opened, the old man quietly closed with his own hand. A lesser man might have accepted that refusal and walked away. He had offered his help, after all, and the old man had turned it down. The debt, one could argue, was paid in the offering. But the man in the leather cut had not driven across the state to be turned away by the very stubbornness that had put the judge in danger in the first place. And more than that, he had not come empty-handed. Because here is the thing about a man who spends 20 years waiting to repay a debt. He learns patience. He learns how to watch and how to listen and how to move quietly through a world that assumes he isn't paying attention. And in the days he had spent sitting silent in the back of that courtroom, he had not merely been watching the old man. He had been watching the two officers. He had been asking questions in the places where people talked to men like him and not to men with badges. He had been pulling on a thread, and that thread led straight to everything Pruitt and Dolan had built. He came back to the lawyer, and this time he did not talk about the old man's past. He talked about the officer's present. He had learned, in his quiet way, that Halloran was not the first person these two had railroaded, that there was a whole trail of them, a pattern stretching back months, a machine that ran on frightened people and disappearing money. Civil forfeiture, cash that went in and never came out, arrests that padded the numbers and lined channels no one was watching. It was a racket, and rackets leave residue. He had begun to gather that residue. There was, he had discovered, dashcam footage that told a very different story than the reports filed alongside it. Footage the officers had assumed no one would ever think to pull, from stops that had never quite matched the paperwork. There was a paper trail, if someone knew where to look, showing seized money that had never been properly accounted for. And most dangerous of all, there was a person, a witness the two officers believed they had silenced long ago, someone they'd frightened into staying quiet after one of their earlier schemes, someone who had never forgotten what was done to them, and who, given a reason and a little courage, was willing to talk at last. Do you understand what that meant? The tools to blow the entire frame apart were now sitting in that courthouse. Not just to clear the old man, though it would do that, but to expose the whole operation, to turn the guns of the law back around on the two men who had been abusing it. Everything Pruitt had so carefully built, every wall of that structure, was suddenly standing on ground that could be pulled out from under it. The biker had, in his silent patience, assembled the very thing that could end this. And he laid it all out before the old man. The footage, the trail, the witness ready to speak. He told Halloran that he did not have to pull rank, did not have to use his title, did not have to betray a single one of his precious principles. This was not about who the old man used to be. This was about what these two officers had actually done. This was the truth, the real, hard, documented truth, standing on nothing but itself, exactly the way the old judge had always insisted it should. All he had to do was allow it into the room. And the old man shook his head. Now here you must understand that this was not the same refusal as before. The lawyer certainly didn't understand it. She was nearly frantic now, because the clock was running out, because a conviction was days away, because for the second time she was watching a drowning man refuse the rope. This wasn't pride about a title anymore. The biker had solved that problem, had brought her clean evidence of real crimes. There was no principle left to violate. And still, the old man would not simply say yes, use it. She could not comprehend it. The biker had brought him a way out that honored everything he claimed to believe in, and he was hesitating. The biker had everything they needed to end it. But the judge shook his head one last time. And that's when the old man finally understood what the man in leather had really come to say. It wasn't about evidence at all. What the old man finally understood, sitting there across from a man he had helped and forgotten, was this. The biker had not come to hand him a rescue and ask permission to use it. He had come to give something back. For 20 years he had carried a debt that no amount of ordinary living could discharge. And now, at last, the universe had handed him the one chance he'd been waiting for. To refuse his help was not to protect a principle. It was to deny another man the thing he needed most in the world, the chance to repay a kindness that had shaped his entire life. And the old judge, who had spent his whole career learning to see what people truly needed, saw it now. This was not charity being offered to him. This was a gift he had no right to refuse. And so, when the court reconvened, something in the room was different. The session began as it always did. The drone of procedure, the shuffle of files, the two officers seated with the easy confidence of men who believed they had already won. Pruitt wore his careful smile. Dolan sat beside him, solid and unbothered, a man who had followed his partner into this the way he'd followed him into everything. And then, from the very back of the gallery, a man stood up. He did not shout. He simply rose to his feet, the leather of his cut creaking in the sudden quiet, and asked, respectfully, plainly, to be heard. Every head in the courtroom turned. The bailiff shifted, and at the front of the room, the two officers turned to look at the stranger who had been sitting silent through every hearing, the man they'd never once bothered to wonder about. It was Dolan who recognized him first. You could see it move across his face like a shadow crossing a field. The slow, dawning horror of a man realizing that the ground beneath him was not solid after all. Dolan had been there, 20 years ago, in a different capacity, in a different town. Or perhaps he had simply heard the name, the reputation, the story of who this man had become in the 2 decades since he'd walked out of that courtroom a free man. Whatever it was, Dolan knew. And the color drained out of his face in a single moment, because he understood, before Pruitt did, that whoever this man was, he had not come to that courthouse to watch quietly. He had come to end something. Pruitt caught it a beat later, watching his partner's face collapse, and for the first time in this entire story, the careful arithmetic behind his eyes failed him. He could not make this add up. He did not know who the man was. He only knew that the stranger's calm was not the calm of a bystander. It was the calm of a man holding cards, and the sudden terror on Dolan's face told him those cards were bad. And in that charged, suspended moment, the old man made his choice. moved beyond words by the sight of it, by a man he barely remembered helping, standing up in open court to defend him after 20 years of silence. Halloran finally let the truth into the room. He rose, slowly, the way an old man rises, and he let himself become, for the first time since he'd come to Miller's Crossing, exactly who he was. Not a drifter, not a confused old stranger who'd wandered into trouble. He allowed his full name and his full history to fill that courtroom. 30 years on the bench, a circuit judge who had handed down verdicts in more cases than most of the people in that room had ever seen. The robe he had packed away, he unpacked in a single breath, not to pull rank, but because the man who had come to save him deserved to save someone worth saving. And the entire room reoriented around him. It is a remarkable thing to watch, the moment a crowd realizes it has been looking at something completely wrong. The old man who had been an object of pity, a gray face at the mercy of the machine, was suddenly the most formidable person in the room. The stoop in his shoulders straightened. The silence that had been twisted into evidence of guilt was revealed for what it truly was. The restraint of a man who understood this system better than anyone present. And the two officers, who had chosen him precisely because they believed no one would ever believe a word he said, sat frozen at the front of that courtroom, watching their disposable drifter become a retired judge before their eyes. The kindness he had shown a young man 20 years ago, offered freely and then forgotten, had traveled all that distance and all those years to arrive exactly here, exactly now, exactly when he needed it most. That is the thing about grace. It is never truly lost. It only waits for its moment to come home. But revealing who the old man was only opened the door. What walked through it next is what truly ended them. Because now, with the court's full attention and a defense that finally had teeth, everything the biker had quietly gathered came into the light. And here the whole scheme performed a terrible piece of irony, one that Pruitt, of all people, should have appreciated. The very report the two officers had built to destroy a nobody became the instrument of their own undoing. They had made it clean. They had made it airtight, every detail cross-checked, every time and place recorded precisely, exactly, so that no one could argue with it. But a document that's specific is only a strength as long as nothing can be checked against it. The moment there was something to compare it to, all that careful precision became a cage the officers had built around themselves. The biker had the timeline. He had traced where the two officers had actually been, what had actually happened in that gravel lot, the real sequence of events on the day they'd cuffed the old man. And when Halloran's account, now the account of a credible retired judge rather than a dismissed drifter, was laid alongside the officer's own report, the contradictions opened like cracks in ice. The report said one thing. The truth said another. And then came the footage. The dashcam the officers had never imagined anyone would pull told its own quiet, damning story. It did not match their paperwork. It showed a stop that had unfolded nothing like the version they'd filed. And once one piece of their record was shown to be a lie, every other piece fell under suspicion, because that is how these things work. A single proven falsehood poisons the whole well. The clean report was no longer a shield. It was a confession, signed in Dolan's own careful hand, of exactly how they had lied and when. And it did not stop at the old man's case. Because the biker had pulled the thread all the way back, and it led to the whole operation. The pattern of railroaded locals, the seized cash that vanished into unwatched channels, the witness they thought they'd silenced who was now, at last, willing to speak. What the two officers had built to bury one harmless stranger became the exact mechanism that exposed everything. The frame did not just fail. It reversed. The hunters, who had spent months deciding who was weak enough to prey upon, discovered in a single afternoon what it feels like to be the ones with no doors left to run through. And then the court remembered something. Or rather, the old man made sure it did. Because Halloran had never forgotten why any of this began. He had not forgotten the young mechanic. The boy with grease worked deep into his knuckles. The one whose only crime was being poor and alone on the wrong Tuesday morning. That boy was the reason the old man had spoken up in the first place. That boy was the first domino, the original injustice that had set everything else in motion. And now, with the officer's entire operation unraveling in open court, that case could not stay buried either. The planted evidence, the whole rotten stop, all of it came back into the light alongside everything else. The old man never forgot the kid they framed first. And now, neither could the court. If you're feeling this right now, if this is the moment you've been waiting for, do one thing for me. Share this video with one person who still believes good people get the last word. Pruitt thought no one was watching. Look how many of us are. It was, in the end, a complete inversion of everything the two men had set out to do. They had chosen Halloran because they thought he was no one. They had built their frame because they thought no one was watching. And now the whole structure had turned in their hands and pointed itself back at them, brick by careful brick, until the two officers who had walked into that courtroom certain of victory sat there and watched their empire come apart in front of the very people they had counted on to never notice. The reckoning, when it came, was not loud. Real justice rarely is. It does not arrive with the thunder we imagine. It arrives as paperwork and hearings and the slow, grinding turn of the same machinery that the two officers had spent so long abusing, now pointed, at last, in the right direction. The charges against Halloran evaporated, as they should have from the very beginning. But that was only the smallest part of it. For Pruitt and Dolan, the afternoon in that courtroom was the end of everything they had built. The badges they had hidden behind were stripped away. The clean reports they had filed became the evidence in an investigation that reached back through every case they had touched, every frightened person they had shaken down, every dollar that had disappeared. Men who abuse a system for long enough come to believe they are the system, untouchable, permanent. Pruitt and Dolan learned the oldest lesson there is, that the law they had treated as their private tool was never theirs at all, and that it has a long memory for the people who betray it. What waited for them now was a reckoning measured not in dollars, but in years. And the old man, the court, having realized how gravely it had wronged him, was prepared to give him everything back in the grandest way it could. There were officials suddenly eager to shake his hand, to apologize, to make a public ceremony of restoring the dignity they had so carelessly stripped away. They wanted to celebrate him, this distinguished retired judge they had mistaken for a drifter. Halloran wanted none of it. He accepted the clearing of his name because the truth mattered to him, and always had. But he did not want the ceremony, or the apologies, or the attention. When it was over, he did the most quietly remarkable thing a man in his position could do. He went home. He climbed back into his rusted pickup with the heater that only worked on the passenger side, and he drove back down the gravel road to the small house at the end of it, where a fishing rod still leaned against the porch rail and a photograph of a woman with kind eyes still sat on the mantel. But he was not quite the same man who had left. Something had shifted in him. He had come to Miller's Crossing to disappear, to be nobody, to fold his old life away and pull the world's attention off of him for good. And the ordeal had taught him, against his own intentions, that a man cannot truly hide from the world without also hiding from the good in it. He still took his coffee at the same corner booth. But now he looked up when the door opened. He nodded a little longer. He let himself be seen. The grief that had sent him into hiding had not vanished, but it had loosened its grip, and in its place was something that looked almost like belonging. He had reconnected, quietly, to a world he had spent 3 years turning away from. And there was one more thing. Before the biker rode out of that town, the two men shared a moment together. The man in the leather cut and the old man in the faded flannel, standing somewhere outside that plain brick courthouse in the ordinary light of an ordinary afternoon. There were no speeches. Neither of them was the kind of man who reached for grand words, and neither of them needed to. 20 years had brought them, by the strangest of roads, back to standing in front of each other. One had looked at a young man the whole world had written off and seen something worth saving. The other had never forgotten it, and had crossed a state to make sure the debt came home. They simply looked at each other, and in that look was everything that didn't need saying. A nod, a hand extended and taken. Two men who had each, in his own time and his own way, saved the other. And then the biker swung a leg over his machine, and the engine turned over, and he rode off down the road, leaving behind him a debt that was, after 20 long years, finally and fully paid. So what are we left with when the engine fades down that road and the dust settles back onto an ordinary afternoon? We are left with a truth so simple that we forget it, and so powerful that forgetting it costs us dearly. A small act of kindness is never wasted. It only waits. Think of it. 20 years earlier, a judge read a file that no one else bothered to read, and chose to see a human being where the whole world saw a lost cause. He did not do it for a reward. He did not do it expecting anything to come of it. He forgot the young man's face almost as soon as he'd ruled, the way we forget most of the good we do, letting it fall behind us like footprints we never look back to see. He had no idea that he was planting a seed. He had no idea that 2 decades later, in his darkest and most helpless hour, when he was alone and framed in moments from losing everything, that seed would come back grown into the one thing that could save him. That is how kindness works. It does not vanish when we stop watching it. It travels quietly through the years, through the lives it touches, and it waits for the moment it is needed most. The old man's mercy did not disappear. It simply took 20 years to come home. The 2 men who tried to bury a good man are gone from that badge forever. But this channel is built on the ones who stood up. If you stand with the judge and the biker, not the men who hid behind their badges. Subscribe and stay with me. There's another true story of unexpected kindness waiting for you right now. Don't let it wait.